everybody. Thank you. Nothing like a few technical hiccups to start the session, hence the beer, I think. So thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. People have called me a lot of things since I started working on the web. I try to forget most of them. But Jeffrey Zeldman, without whom I think most of us wouldn't be here, he called me a triple-talented bastard. Sample that one. Now, I've been designing for the web most of my working life, so it feels like I know the medium pretty well. But I've seen it change beyond what we see on screen, beyond the emergence of those web standards technologies that Jeffrey Zeldman championed, and beyond the rise of mobile and the challenges of responsive design. And at the same time, I'm watching our industry mature into something that's very different from the joyfully naive, creative playground that it was when I started. Because it's now a place where designers rub shoulders with developers, with researchers, scientists, user experience professionals. And much of what we do has been for the better. Much of what we've done has changed the web for the better, and our combined knowledge and experience, plus the growing maturity of the ways in which we work, that's led to a better web. But as proud as I am with what we've achieved, I look at today's web with a growing sense of dissatisfaction, almost melancholy, because for everything that we've gained, I fear that there's something that we're losing. When we focus our thoughts onto processes, methods, and mechanics instead of ideas, we're losing the creative soul of our work. A soul that really embodies individuality, personality, originality, and some opinion. A soul that connects people with ideas, that makes our work memorable, and it makes what we do matter. I fear that our designs are lacking energy, spontaneity, because we're thinking too early and too often about the consequences of failure. And I fear that we're creating a web that's full of safe designs because we're driven by the need in some of us for predictability, for reliability, and for repeatability. And we're creating a web which rarely dares to stray beyond the boundaries of established conventions. Now, I don't feel that all is lost. I still really hope that we'll recover our ability to be creative. And I really hope that this soulless period is going to pass like others have before it. So I'm hopeful that we're still capable of making work that, as Johnny Ive said, can suck the air from a room. Giving our work soul, making space and time for creativity and experimentation, and above all for ideas, that's the subject of the talk. And it's a title that I've taken from a quote by Mad Men's Don Draper. It's from an episode called The Monolith, set in season 7 in 1968. And Don was told that the IBM 360 computer can count more stars in a day than we can in a lifetime. And Don said, "But what man laid on his back, counting stars, and thought about a number?" The advertising world that Don inhabits is going to be the background to this talk, because I believe that advertising is one place where we can look for the soul that we're missing. And it's also where we can learn as much about clear and concise communication, reduction and simplification, as we can in what many now call user experience. You know, I find advertising fascinating, but I do know not everybody shares my enthusiasm. As someone who studied fine art, I believe that the job of solving our biggest problems should be for artists, as well as for designers or for engineers. But I'm as much a sucker for an artist quote as I am about advertising, and Banksy, however, doesn't share my fondness. He wrote, "People are taking the piss out of you every day. They butt into your life, take a cheap shot at you, and then disappear. They leer at you from tall buildings and make you feel small. They're on TV making your girlfriend feel inadequate. They have access to the most sophisticated technology the world has ever seen, and they bully you with it. They are the advertisers, and they're laughing at you." Now, there's a common perception that advertising is an industry that routinely interrupts you when you least want interrupting, that regularly attempts to sell you products that you neither need nor want, and it lies to you as it sells. Writer and humorist Stephen Leacock once wrote, "Advertising may be described as the science of arresting the human intelligence long enough to get money from it." Ouch. You know, for some, advertising's become a dirty word. I mean, how can an industry, which some might argue is outdated and irrelevant, how can that teach us anything about the very different industry that we work in today? So in his book, Purple Cow, Seth Godin wants us to stop advertising and start innovating, because as consumers, we're too busy to pay attention to advertising. Yet he acknowledges that it's probably impossible to read through a list of successful brands without either picturing one of their commercials, remembering their taglines, or hearing the jingles ringing in our ears. Advertising's given us some of the strongest and most memorable creative work in decades. And the mark of great advertising is that it stays with us long after a campaign is over. So I guess that for every culture and for every country and generation, they remember particular advertising. For me, it's DDB's chimpanzee campaign for PG Tips tea. It's a very British ad. It's the tea you can really taste. And that campaign began back in 1956 with a black and white commercial and a voiceover by none other than Peter Sellers. And the chimpanzees, they're often voiced by famous actors and comedians. They parodied popular culture, politics, sport, and television for the next 3 decades. In 1971, "Avez-vous un cuppa?" and "Cooey, Mr. Shifter," they became catchphrases. Oh, the marvels of technology. Excuse me for a second, that should have played a video.
Get in the hang of it. Mind the banisters, son.
Oh, I can't hold it, Dad.
Don't worry, son. I shifted more pianos than you've had hot dinners.
Cooey, Mr. Shifter, like refreshments.
Oh, thank you most kindly, madam. One way of shifting it.
When a good cup of tea really counts, you're right to drink Brook Bond PG Tips. It's the tea you can really taste. Dad, do you know the piano's on my foot?
You hum it, son. I'll play it.
I think it's a very British thing. You know, in the first 2 years of the chimpanzee campaign and off the back of its advertising, PG Tips went from 4th position to number 1, and they maintained that top spot for the next 32 years, largely due to their creative advertising. And the campaign was more than just clever copywriting and well-trained chimpanzees. It succeeded because the combination of advertising and entertainment made the pleasure of watching the commercials synonymous with drinking PG Tips tea. Now, I could talk for a full hour about PG Tips and their chimpanzee advertising, or about Leonard Rossiter and Joan Collins' commercials for Cinzano. Don't get me started on Cadbury's instant smashed potato or 1970s Texan bars, which were a toffee chocolate bar which featured a cartoon cowboy and possibly the best, worst tagline, "A man's got to chew what a man's got to chew." Oh, genius. They sure were a mighty chew. Now, today's equivalent might be Whedon and Kennedy's campaign for Old Spice's "The Man Your Man Can Smell Like." Remember this one? It's a series of commercials that cleverly targeted a male body wash product at female buyers who imagined their man smelling like the man in the commercials. Now, some people confuse advertising with misleading people about a product, but successful and effective advertising, through a process of reduction, of removing messages that might cloud communication, it aims to communicate and to emphasize a truth about a product or a service or a brand. And DDB's famous campaign for the Volkswagen Beetle, a campaign that really invented the modern advertising industry, that wasn't just memorable for its clever copywriting or for the distinctive art direction, but because it told the truth about Volkswagen's product. The Beetle was noisy and it was small, but it was also well-built and reliable. And DDB's advertising didn't hide that, and the consumers responded to it and the messages that the advertising conveyed. The Beetle was a smart choice, and people aspired to feeling smart about choosing one. You know, in many ways, the ad said, "This car is smart and individual like you." Successful advertising always provokes an emotional response in us as consumers. And as Don Draper said in the first ever episode of Mad Men, advertising is based on one thing: happiness. And you know what happiness is? Happiness is the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of the road that screams reassurance that whatever you're doing is okay. You are okay. Now, Old Spice is "The Man Your Man Could Smell Like" commercials. They don't say anything about the product at all, apart from the fact that it doesn't smell lady-scented. But they also knowingly play on the fact that the advertisers and the audience know that this product is not going to turn men into Isaiah Mustafa. Now, I would argue that Old Spice also told the truth about what it thinks many women consumers were thinking. They wanted their man to smell and look like Isaiah. Leonard Rossiter, Joan Collins, and the Cinzano advertisers, they told the truth too. Just like Rossiter's character, Cinzano was pretending to belong to a higher social class. And for 30 years, PG Tips owned the truth about tea. Drinking a cup of PG Tips makes people happy. Now, all of these campaigns conveyed messages about the products that they advertised, and they did so with the charm and the personality and the wit that's so vital in making creative work memorable. Now, while we can all probably point to a memorable commercial like PG Tips, or a poster campaign like United Colors of Benetton, or a magazine ad like Levi 501 Black, can you point to as memorable a website from recent times? You know, I can think of many, many websites that are all well presented, easy to use, maybe a triumph of user experience. They're technically competent, but few that are going to be remembered for years to come. Why do you think that is? Why are so few websites memorable? Why do so few bear their souls? What could be the reason? Could the processes that we've come to rely on be hindering our creativity? I think they already have. Web design magazines are full of advice about principles and process, but little about creativity, about humanity. Has our current preoccupation with user experience methodologies meant that we're less willing to take risks? I fear it already has. Does our reliance on research and testing mean that we're simply delegating decision-making and abdicating responsibility for our designs. I've seen that happen. I've seen that they do. And have we become so fixated with designing digital products that we've forgotten that the web is a medium for communication outside of applications? Can our emphasis on human-to-computer interaction mean that we're forgetting the importance of human-to-human communication? Now, I believe that all of these factors have combined to create an environment that produces work that, while it's aesthetically pleasing, well-considered and technically accomplished, it still lacks the emotional appeal that's as important as functional abilities. He's been mentioned before, but in April of this year, A List Apart magazine published a letter to a junior designer by the columnist and product designer at Twitter, Kenneth Bowles. And in it, he made his case for young or new designers to slow down, to think it through, and to temper their passions. Slow down, he said. You pluck an idea from the branch and you throw it onto the plate before it's got time to ripen. And he went on. Perhaps your teachers exalted the idea as the gem of creative work, taught you that the idea is the hard part. I disagree, he said. Ideas aren't to be trusted. They need to be wrung dry, ripped apart. When I read his words and I thought about the junior designers that Kenneth was writing to, I imagined design as it might be in some dystopian future, where there's so little time for an idea to blossom before it's crushed under the boot of user experience. You know, when Kenneth wrote, "In time, the distinction between idea and iteration will blur, and eventually the two will become one," I just read the words of George Orwell. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Like Winston Smith's character at the end of 1984, I imagine the junior designers that Kenneth was writing to as disheartened and demoralized. So I felt compelled to respond. So I wrote a very different letter to a junior designer, one that I hoped would inspire rather than depress those same junior designers. I wanted to tell them that there can be a future where their energy and their enthusiasm will make a difference, that they must never forget that it's ideas that matter most, and that without them there'll be nothing. That you can't turn a poor idea into a brilliant one by iterating, and that instead of having fewer ideas, we must make more. Don't slow down, as Kenneth said, speed up, I wrote. You know, to keep ideas happening, make more of them more often. Feed your mind with inspiration wherever you can find it. Exercise it with play and make idea after idea until making them becomes a reflex. You know, the truth is, we don't always have to think things through, at least not right away. We can never predict the path that our ideas will take, and we can't know the restrictions that they'll face or the limitations that we put on them. And too often, I see brilliant ideas extinguished because people think about practicalities too early. How will it be built? How will people use it? So before we pinch out the flickering flame of a new idea, let it burn brightly for a little while longer, unhindered by practicalities. Now, this tension between approaches to design, between data-led and implementation-led digital product design and ideas-led web design, as so starkly illustrated by these two respective letters, that's not a new phenomenon. In 1968, Madmen Sterling Cooper and Partners Agency, they were installing their first computer. It was a room-filling, low-humming IBM 360 that I mentioned earlier. Now, of course, this being Mad Men, Nothing's ever as straightforward as installing a computer. Entering the future meant installing that computer on the site of the agency's creative lounge, which was a space where art directors and copywriters met to collaborate. And the creatives were then forced back into their separate offices, afraid that the computer would replace them. Don Draper asks the engineer who's installing the computer, who's winning? Who's replacing more humans? And new partner Jim Cutler's vision for SC&P, that's in stark contrast to Don's. And in the final episode of the season, Jim says, I know what this company should look like. Computer services. This agency is too dependent on creative personalities. We need to tell our clients we're thinking about the future, not creative hijinks. Creative hijinks. Sir John Hegarty is a co-founder of advertising agency Bartle Bogle Hegarty, BBH, and he wrote, it's essential for a creative company to have a point of view, a philosophical foundation for their work. And a point of view is an essential part of design because, like the best art, the best design must stand for something. And we should ask ourselves, what does my work or my company stand for? What are our principles? We must stand behind our work because we believe in it, not because our point of view has been evolved through iteration, been validated by testing or driven by research. You know, I guess I'm simply proving advertising legend David Ogilvy correct when he wrote, creative people are stubbornly allergic to research. But we should temper our use of data with hunches, and vice versa, because as Kenneth wrote, product design that's driven entirely by data is horrible. It's soul-destroying for a designer. Now, I'd like you to cast your mind back to advertising ideas that have stayed with you. If you're a British beer drinker, John Davey, I'm looking at you, you might remember BBH's The Cream of Boddington's campaign for Boddington's Brewery in the 1990s. Now, in 1997, Boddington's sales peaked, largely attributed to their clever advertising. If you've got more exotic tastes, you might recall Saatchi & Saatchi's campaign for Castlemaine 4X. Now, the 4X brand was actually introduced in 1924, and the 4Xs refer to the tradition of using X's to indicate the strength of beer. Saatchi's made the beer a household name in the 80s with a campaign that featured the tagline, Australians wouldn't give a 4X for anything else. Foster's Lager is owned by a South African brewing company, and its brand is licensed in Europe by a Dutch company, Heineken International. And still, Foster's is stereotypically the amber nectar in the UK, or Australian for beer pretty much everywhere else, except Australia, where they sell very little beer to thirsty Australians. Now, personally, I'm a bit more of a tea drinker, and you can probably guess I drink PG Tips. And the Tips was added to the brand name to emphasize the fact that PG used only the freshest parts of the tea plant. But it wasn't until 1956 that Peter Sellers provided the voice for that first commercial. Where do you think the idea for that commercial came from? Did it come from asking a focus group? Did Brook Bond conduct any consumer research? No. The idea that lasted 3 decades, came when a copywriter at Davidson, Pierce, Berry, and Spotswood, he was stuck for an idea, and he went for a walk around Regent's Park Zoo, and he saw chimpanzees dressed like humans having a tea party to entertain visitors. Now, I bet that if you asked a group of 1950s tea drinkers to personify tea, they'd probably suggest a beautiful Indian lady picking tea, before they told you about Ada, the chimpanzee tea lady. Cooey, Mr. Shifter. No market research, no listening to consumers, no work on personas could stimulate an idea of the magnitude of the PG Tips chimps. What mattered in the 1950s, in those early days of TV advertising, matters today on the web. It's the idea. An amazing, brilliant, crazy, delightful, entertaining, fantastic, gigantic, hilarious, inspiring idea. An idea that can encourage and engage and make people think and change their perceptions. As John Hegarty, the creative force behind The Cream of Manchester, wrote, ideas are the building blocks of creativity. Without one, you have nothing. Now, while I imagine a website designed to sell tea, I expect it to be well designed, technically proficient, and easy to use. When I'm buying a packet of PG Tips, I expect the process to be quick and smooth. Those aspects of user experience and usability that focus on ensuring that a product or a service work well, they're important. But that's not enough for me. There's no magic in simply making something easy to use. Where do the chimpanzees fit into the process? Now, we regularly hear the word process in relation to designing for the web. And recently, our conversations about design have been dominated by process. One process that's been spoken about regularly over the past year has been designing a web page or an application's elements outside of the context of the layout to form some sort of style guide. Common patterns that will be used across a website or an application's design. We mentioned material design, mentioned earlier on. These might include layout patterns for components or form elements or modules or navigation. And in my studio, we refer to this as building a toolkit. And I wrote about something similar in 2012 when I wrote about designing atoms and elements in a book for Smashing magazine. And I gave this combination of typography, color, and texture that's in the absence of layout a name, and I called it atmosphere. An atmosphere describes the feelings that are evoked by color and texture and typography. And you might already think of atmosphere in different terms. You might call it feel or mood. And separating components from layout, it can help everyone to focus on their design without setting expectations. But I worry that we're becoming intoxicated by processes like this, and we're losing sight of what we're ultimately making. Now, one design system that's become synonymous with responsive design is Brad Frost's atomic design. And he describes it as a methodology used to construct design systems. That methodology even has a tool called Pattern Lab to use to create atomic design systems. And Brad first wrote about atomic design last year, and he said, lately, I've become more interested in what our interfaces are comprised of and how we can construct design systems in a more methodical way. And he goes on to how he describes how his atomic design system is comprised of atoms and molecules and organisms and templates and pages. And Brad's inspiration for atomic design was chemistry's periodic table. And although I can't think of anything less creatively stimulating, I can imagine someone who's driven to make the creative process predictable, finding comfort in the atomic design process. Now, not everyone's convinced about abstracting design the atomic design way, and Mark Bolton wrote last year about his concerns. Conformity and efficiency have a price, and that price is design. That price is a feeling of humanity, of something that's been created from scratch. What I described is not a design process, it's manufacturing. It's a cupcake machine churning out identical cakes with different icing. but they all taste the same. And I think it's important to remember that creativity can never be, almost by definition, should never be, as predictable as manufacturing. We can't and we shouldn't attempt to rationalize creativity by turning it into a process. Creativity is so often chaotic and unpredictable. You know, you go for a walk and you might get an idea. You might take a shower and you might get another one. Ideas come when we least expect them. Enjoy yourself, laugh, and above all, have fun. David Ogilvy wrote, "Make it fun to work at your agency." When people aren't having any fun, they seldom produce great advertising. So get away from your sketchbook, get away from your notebook or your computer, and get inspiration from the world around you. Spend the day at the zoo watching chimpanzees. I do. Now, I can imagine how some of you are wondering, if creativity is so chaotic, how can it work inside a well-disciplined business framework? Now, others formalize their process into a workflow. The former head of design at Google and at Yahoo, Irene Au, she defined user research, followed by interaction and product design, visual design, then prototyping and developing, formative and summative research, qualitative and quantitative data and analysis, psychology, anthropology, and human-computer interaction, wireframes, prototypes, functional specifications, and flowcharts. Where is the space in her workflow for creating work that's anything more than the adornment she describes when she wrote so dismissively? They, meaning visual designers, understand that visual adornment is meant to support the experience, not be the experience. Irene's assessment of creativity really shocks me. And she wrote recently about whether to hire a visual designer, and she said, "Hire a visual designer on a freelance basis who can create the look and feel of the site, deliver a style guide, and work to build visual assets to create UI that's consistent." Is it any wonder why Irene and others have such a dismissive opinion about how designers work when we're busy promoting processes like atomic design? A process is a tried and tested method that we've used to do something we've done before. But what's the point of following a formula? A formula will lead to predictable, ordinary results. And who wants to make something ordinary? I hope you don't. Now, I know that the answer lies somewhere between chaos and process, so that creativity isn't limited in any way by the parts of the process that we adopt. Now, David Ogilvy was a strong advocate of long copy, sometimes very long. He wrote in his On Advertising book, "All my experiences say that for many great products, long copy sells more than short." And he cited one successful advertising campaign for Merrill Lynch in the New York Times that ran to 6,450 words. And he wrote, "Advertisements with long copy convey the impression that you have something important to say, whether people read the copy or not." Now, this runs counter to what many people would expect, particularly on websites. Now, things really changed in the late 1950s with Doyle Day and Bernbach's DDB's widely cited Think Small and Lemon ads for the Volkswagen of America. They were art directed by Helmut Krohn. Here's the body copy from Think Small. It was written by Julian Koenig. Count how many selling points there are. Think small. Our little car isn't so much of a novelty anymore. A couple of dozen college kids don't try to squeeze inside it. The guy at the gas station doesn't ask where the gas goes. Nobody even stares at our shape. In fact, some people who drive our little flivver don't think 32 miles to the gallon is going great guns, or using 5 pints of oil instead of 5 quarts, or never needing antifreeze, or racking up 40,000 miles on a set of tires. That's because once you get used to some of our economies, you don't even think about them anymore, except when you squeeze into a small parking spot, or renew your small insurance, or pay a small repair bill, or trade your old VW for a new one. Think it over. That's 136 words, 8 selling points, not including possibly the most important fact that the VW is free of college kids. Having had a college kid, I can tell you how important that is. And there were more classic taglines. It makes your house look bigger when it's parked outside. The only water a Volkswagen needs is the water to wash it with. And after we paint the car, we paint the paint. Now, Bernbach's not only credited with changing the style of advertising, he's also credited with changing the way that copywriters and art directors work on ads. And before Bernbach, copywriters and art directors worked separately. Copywriters wrote the copy for an ad, and then they sent it to an art director in another department to add the visuals. And Bernbach had a theory. If art directors and copywriters worked together in a creative team, they'd produce better advertising. And he was proven right, because out of these creative pairings, his agency produced some of the most iconic work of that period. And throughout the decades that followed, Bernbach, creative teams of art directors and copywriters, they remained at the center of advertising. Now, the roles did change. A copywriter's role changed, and while imaginative headlines became important, long copy became unfashionable. And the emphasis in advertising shifted more towards the visual and away from long passages of written copy. And copywriting focused on reduction. So writing a tagline meant using as few words as possible. Now today, I think that copywriting matters more than any time since Ogilvy's era. On the web, we need copy that's effective from 140 characters in a tweet through a Facebook message to an email newsletter and up to long-form web content. And designers, we need to write copy. We need to write copy ourselves or work in a new style creative team with a copywriter throughout all the stages of a project. And clients, they should make copywriting a priority and make provision for it within their budgets right from the beginning. And copy should never be an afterthought, something that gets added to already designed page templates. You know, because thinking about words can be a real catalyst for new ideas, and it can help us to create better strategies. And we designers need to take responsibility for copy too. You know, for years we've complained about waiting for clients to provide us with content. And then we complain some more about the quality of what we eventually receive. You know, why are we surprised by the lack of quality and by a client's lack of writing skills? You know, after all, a client may know their business inside out or their product better than anyone, but that doesn't necessarily give them the skills to write. Why do we expect someone who works in finance or manufacturing or a service to be good at writing advertising copy for the web or for anywhere else? Communicating through written copy is as creative a task as creating color palettes or designing with type or working with layout. And you know, my agency, we think of copy as being at the center of everything that we do. And we spend an enormous amount of time now writing and editing content for our clients. And working with people to write copy. That really helps us to develop deeper relationships. And when we get to know our clients better, we end up with better work. And that's why we now know more about Drupal development and health and safety inspections and pension planning than we did a year ago. And for us, this is as much a part of user experience design process as devising personas and making wireframes. Now, it does make me wonder whether copyright is an outdated term, and I can't think really what to replace it with. Probably not creative writer, probably something just as simple, writer. Simple, and it gets straight to the point. Now, an art director's role has also changed as new media and technologies have emerged. So just as it did as the advertising industry moved from print-based work to embrace television, we've seen a similar change demanded by the web and everything that's associated with it. And one of the biggest issues facing art direction on the web is that so few people understand what it is and how it differs from design. You know, if you ask a web designer what they think when they hear the words art direction, many people will mention the trend for individually designed articles or blog posts. Now, there are overlaps between creative direction, art direction, and design, so it shouldn't come as much of a surprise when people use those terms interchangeably. But the role of a designer is different from the role of an art director. Art directors provide a concept, and designers provide the ideas and the expertise to implement that concept. Dan Maul, he does a really great job of explaining the difference between art direction and design. Art direction is the visceral resonance of how a piece of work feels. In other words, what you feel in your gut when you look at a website, an app, or any piece of design work. Whereas he explained good design as precision. Design is the technical execution. Do the colors match? Is the line length comfortable for long periods of reading? Is the photo in focus? Does the typographic hierarchy work? Is the composition balanced? Now, we need the skills of a designer when we're creating the look, but the feel, that requires the skills of an art director who can ensure that the messages aren't lost through design. Phil Kaufman, he's an art director at Springbox, and he said, the two roles differ in that the designer is more concerned with execution, while the art director is concerned with the strategy behind that execution. Now, on the web, we've become so fixated with problem solving and execution that our work has lost the creative soul that I spoke about at the start of this talk. Dan Maul explained, art direction brings clarity and definition to our work. Without art direction, we're left with dry, sterile experiences that are easily forgotten. And much of the work that I see on the web today is exactly as Dan describes. Dry, sterile. And I partly blame the lack of art direction for this lack of soul. And I also blame our fixation with the mechanics of user experience design. You know, Irene Au's list of UX skills includes only user research, interaction and product design, visual design, prototyper, web developer, and front-end developer. Where is anything approaching the role of art director in her UX talent list? Now, why is art direction on the web so rare? In 2003, Jeffrey Zeldman wrote, on the web, art direction is rare, partly because much of the work is about guiding users rather than telegraphing concepts, but also because few schools teach art direction. And he went on, today's stylists continually enrich the world's visual vocabulary. The bad news is that we're decorating instead of communicating. Stylists, decorating, visual adornment, just like Irene Au described 11 years later. Now, I think that art director and designer Stephen Hay can sum up the importance of art direction for us when he wrote, "Good design is pretty, but good design based on a solid concept will help make your sites more effective and memorable, especially when compared to the competition." Now, many of the agencies that I deal with today, they still favor the types of creative teams that were first established in the late 1950s. But the web is a significantly more complex medium to work in than print. So we need a variety of people with an even wider variety of skills on a team today. And there may be less of a requirement for a traditional copywriter-art director pairing, but there is a requirement to bring together people with diverse skills. An art director, a writer, a developer, a UX specialist, so that they can collaborate in ways that traditionally art directors and copywriters did. And this is a significant change for many agencies who still structure their businesses along departmental lines. In a creative organization, we need people to be familiar with each other's work so that they can feel comfortable enough to share ideas and to sometimes take risks. And proximity matters, as does uniting teams of diverse people together so that they can sit in one creative space and not be isolated in separate departments. So, I guess, to sum up, much of what's changed since I began working on the web has been for the better. You know, in many ways, we've made a better web, and I am proud of what we've achieved. But I'm still restless, a little bit dissatisfied. But I'm really hopeful that all's not lost and that we can carry on making work that's memorable if we focus as much on creativity as we do on implementation. You know, we need to amplify conversations about ideas as much as we do about those on process. And if we create processes that promote creative ideas from the very beginning and remember the importance of art directing, if we make spaces for people with diverse skills to work together in creative teams, we'll make creative work that matters and that will live way beyond us. So thank you very much for listening.